That photograph is me exactly 30 years ago. I was the CEO of Greenpeace, and I have to say, in Australia, and I have to say it was without doubt one of the most exhilarating roles I've ever held, and at the same time, the most grueling, the most difficult, and in many ways, the most lonely.
I was getting initiated to become a Hindu monk. And so I was basically in that trajectory. And I was very excited. I was really hoping that I'll be paired with somebody who's one of these really intelligent professors. Got paired with a local farmer who didn't speak English. And then I was devastated. But man, oh man, I was shocked. I was shocked. He read me like a book. He had insights into my consciousness that I had no idea how he got it.
So Lynette Thorstensen is the chair of Fairtrade International Boards. I should say both Lynette and Sushant are dear friends of mine. Lynette is a New Zealander and she's living and working in France, and she's devoted her career to social and environmental justice. And as I'm starting to say this, you'll start to hear our theme of diversity emerging, our theme of diverse perspectives and experiences coming out in this introduction already. She, in addition to Fairtrade International Board, has been the Chief Executive of Greenpeace Australia. She was my boss at one point in time as well. So if you're asking questions, you might get a beautiful stories from both of us if we have time, or stick around at the end. She's also been the Executive Director of Social Development and Environment with the Australian New South Wales Premier's Department, Managing Director of Communications with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in Switzerland, and many other roles in this diverse life across non-government organizations, business, government, and the community. It's a little bit similar with Sushant. Sushant's the founding partner of Humanitas Smart Planet Fund, and he is a strategist in social finance and an adjunct professor at John F. Kennedy University. We're already contributing to our theme of diversity. All of our speakers have crossed all of these sectors. This continues with Sushant with his current work, which includes a project on Indigenous modernity in Alaska, the Baskin community, a finance equity project in Nepal in partnership with Kathmandu University, and he's been a finance director overseeing operations of 5 startups in 3 countries. And many other roles too. And it's also something that both Sushant, Lynette, and I realized. We're all immigrants, all 3 of us, and possibly all of you. We span the USA, Australia, New Zealand, France, Nepal, India. We are living and working in diverse cultures and continents, and those cultures are different within us and have shifted within us. And you'll hear a little bit of that today running through both Lynette and Sushant's talk. And a really important element of that around assisting our human growth, around taking our own widening and broadening perspectives. It's a strength. You can't innovate when everything's the same. When everything around ourselves and within ourselves shares the same perspectives, nothing changes. And it's so that strength from our cultural diversity, from our global community, from our ability to see and work across, as you've heard, it's a theme through many people's talks in the weeks that we've been together, the ability to synergize and see perspectives across all of those entities is one of the fundamentals that we're hoping to enhance with these adult development models, with this adult development framework and these perspectives. Also critical to allow us to see the emergence of new systems, the emergences of the types of systems that are capable of answering our meta crises like climate and granting us a soft landing. Hence our theme today, diversity. And I'm going to hand over to you, Lynette.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Simon. I'm very, very honoured to join this group and perhaps for an evening become part of your caring circle. I've been in activism a very long time, so I reserve the right to come at this as an older person. Hopefully, I've acquired some wisdom along the way, but I do feel honoured and quite humbled that I can tell you something of my story and share that with you. And please ask me ferocious questions if you wish to. I would really welcome that. one of the things I would say about leadership in any organization, but perhaps particularly non-government organizations, is that we are finally, at long last, moving very seriously into models of co-creation and co-leadership. And I'm so excited by that. And if I could just give you two examples. One is the two remarkable women who are leading Fairtrade International in a co-leadership model. And also I've just heard that Greenpeace in the United States is in a co-creation, co-leadership model. And I'm terribly excited that we are at long last breaking down this lonely role of the CEO, this idea that you have to be remote, all-powerful, tough. And I love the idea that we can share leadership. So how did I get into all of that? Well, that's Norman Kirk. He's a New Zealand Prime Minister, and he took the very brave decision to send a government frigate, a Navy vessel, into the French testing zone of the nuclear testing site as part of Tahiti. And I was very young at this stage, but I wrote him a letter that was published in a national newspaper. So you could say that this was the beginning of my engagement in activism. And this is what he said, and I remember this as a 9-year-old. "We are a small nation, but we will not abjectly surrender to injustice. We have worked against the development of nuclear weapons everywhere and anywhere." So that's how it all began, in my case at least. Then when I was in my 20s, I became very involved in the movement in New Zealand against the Springbok rugby tour. Now, those of you who know anything about New Zealand will know that we're a rugby mad country, and we have this magnificent rugby team called the All Blacks. So here we were, a bunch of very well-meaning, largely white, middle-class activists, extremely concerned about apartheid in South Africa. But we weren't as engaged as we needed to be, perhaps, or understanding with any kind of real subtlety the problems of the Maori people in New Zealand itself. So this was my first set of hard lessons, if you like, in understanding how to build something of an inclusive movement. And I have to say, at the beginning of our work in supporting Black liberation in South Africa, not in New Zealand, there were no Maori people at all involved in the movement. And that obviously had to change, and it did. So this was also my first encounter with organized police violence. It was a very, very shocking thing to see that the state would move in such a way to dislike social protest to such an extent that we were violently battened. I'm actually in that photo and was battened by a rather large police truncheon. So that was also an extremely rapid part of learning about social protest and social activism and the consequences of social activism. So this slide, it's a lovely quote from Nelson Mandela. He heard about this. This was all of the protesters getting onto the rugby field and stopping the rugby match going ahead. You can imagine how the rugby supporters felt about that. So that was the 25th of July, 1981. But if you look closely at that image, you will see that in the front row on the field are a number of Maori elders rightly taking their place in our social movement. So we had made a strong journey where the Indigenous people of colour in our own country were taking really their rightful position in those social protests. I suppose that the next part of my learning was to be part of a profound movement. It was the Marcha por la Paz in Central America, protesting Reagan's contract invasion of Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Honduras. And we were 400 people from 40 different countries, ranging from Buddhist monks from Japan to young activists such as myself from New Zealand, from India, from the United States, Europe, and Africa. So this was an amazing multicultural experience. And we had to learn to listen and learn that the people who had the most outrage were not necessarily the most effective. So there was a whole lot of learning around patience and also allowing perhaps those most affected to be given the dignity of really hearing their voices. This is an example of women who joined our march in Guatemala, whose families, many of these women had sons and daughters who had been disappeared by a dictatorial, very brutal regime in Guatemala. It was hard to keep functioning in some ways. It was so shocking, I think, as a young activist to be part of this and learn about courage and learn to allow, to give the space to give and dignity of these women to really have their voices come forward. So what came next? A number of peace-related roles, some work in government, and then Greenpeace, and then some work in business, and including the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and now my role in Fairtrade. And in many ways, I think I've come full circle, and I'd like to reflect on that. But I would like to talk about Greenpeace a little. I think one of the interesting things about Greenpeace as a movement, and I wanted to just touch on a very important aspect of inclusion, was that Greenpeace was a magnificent organization in many ways. It was, however, set up by 4 what I might call charismatic founders, one of whom in particular perhaps suffered from what's known as charismatic founder syndrome. And let me just say that he was far from an evolved feminist. And this was also a time of different learning, that it was obviously, it's still relatively early days of feminism. And it was a time where we as women needed to learn to stand up for ourselves and be an effective voice, and ensure that women were indeed accessing leadership roles. Yes, some things I learned. So along the way, across all these sectors, here are some things. I would say I learned them the hard way. Listening, really learning to shut up. I mean, I think hopefully I speak less now than I did when I was 20, and less than I did when I was 30. And I did an exit interview actually with the wonderful African woman who's been the global CEO of Fairtrade International, and she's moving on to a new role. In fact, we're replacing her with another remarkable young African woman. But she doesn't say very much. And I think we've all learned from her ability to deeply listen. And when she does speak, she's very, very good at bringing together a summary of positions, an analysis, if you like, a narrative that makes sense to everyone, and a quiet wisdom. So listening's something I've learned. Anger is so often a function and a hallmark of activism and advocacy, particularly activist movements. And Simon will smile at this, because I had an angry, very effective group of feisty activists working for me in Greenpeace, but some of them young men with anger issues, and it needed to go somewhere. It needed to be managed, and it was fine for the fire in the belly side of activism, but not always fine in the way we treated each other. And there were some important lessons about that, I think. Then there's the tough side of calling out poor behavior, being brave both in internal context and external, but how you do that is such a lesson, I think. Encouragement. I was speaking to an international consultant about performance appraisals in social and environmental organizations and NGOs, and he said, you know, the single most thing that in particular executives in those really hard leadership roles say is they do not feel sufficiently acknowledged. And yet that's probably the single easiest thing to fix. Humility, humor. I know there's cross-cultural issues around humor, but I also think you can get beyond those with the right commitment to what I would call a common humanity. Thinking long-term about succession, about skills, planning, and then when you get to my age, handing over with joy. So here I am very recently with our delegation of small farmers, producers at COP26 in Glasgow. So we're at this funny little hotel in Glasgow, which was about actually an hour's drive from Glasgow, because nothing in Glasgow during COP26 was remotely affordable. But what is right about this picture, I think, is that it was small producers themselves who were taking the lion's share of the advocacy, the impacted small farmers of our organisation. And I think in an emblematic way, and if I can leave you with this, there I am in the back of the photograph, guiding from behind, hopefully quietly. I didn't give any interviews, I made no speeches, I gave no presentations. And I think there's something about that journey of humility in our ongoing work in climate advocacy that I've certainly learned from, and I hope perhaps is emblematic and helpful for all of you as well. So perhaps I'll finish on that note and on that photograph.
Thank you, Lynette. That was so fabulous. I'm going to ask, and we're going to hear more from Lynette in the questions at the end of our call today as well. I love the stories, by the way. Totally re-engaged with the times down under at Greenpeace and many other points through our lives. Thank you so much for that. And the reflections on being able to stand and deeply listen are strongly resonant, I'm sure, for many on this call. I'm going to invite Sushant.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you so much, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Never had a thought that my own personal identity crisis would lead to something that I can offer to others. I'm really excited to be here. Before we begin, I'll just like to invite everyone to just pay attention to what is present in our collective. There's such a richness of perspectives here. We all come from so many different backgrounds. There's different languages that's represented in this community. And there's a lot of excitement about what's emerging. So I just want to present that into the room. And if you want to just look around the faces, it's okay to smile. And just look around the faces and see all the wealth of wisdom that's present in the room. Let's take all of that in. And as we become present to what is present, let's also become present to what is absent in the room. What is not here. Let's think about all the languages in the world that's not represented here. Many, many world perspectives that is not here. So it's amazing, isn't it? It's always that there's so much wisdom in the room, and there's so much present in the room, and there's so absent. There's so much absent as well. And so that has been a core of my inquiry, is what's present in my life and what's absent. And I'll jump into that a little bit more. And I think this inquiry really forms my practice of what is underneath diversity and inclusion. What's the ontological pluralism? What is present in my ontology? What is absent in my ontology that informs the diversity and inclusion lens? And so I'll dig into that a little bit more. Some of the key points I'm going to make today, that cultures can incorporate modernity, post-modernity, and beyond. There's often this sense that we are in a linear progression, and this is something that I struggled for a very long time. I propose that there's actually a lot more complex relationship between tradition, modernity, and post-modernity. And this really comes out my inquiry in Nepal, India, Alaska, Peru. And the other thing I'll also say is that transformation, that desire, that eros of transformation has actually been embedded in cultural protocols. It's embedded in different rituals. If we really understand it, it's embedded in many ways that the culture expresses itself through music and arts and all of that. Third point I'll make is we often talk about, especially in the meta theory realm, we often talk about transcend and include. What I've really found myself to be amazing transformative experience is to deepen and transcend. When we go deep into a cultural traditions, come out the other end, it looks something entirely different. And I can speak volumes about that as well. This is a practice that I do every year, at the end of every year, is really looking at the circle of my awareness and what is capacity, what is present in my awareness, what kind of capacities that I have. And that really informs my worldview. If I have to talk about Russia and Ukraine, I'm coming from a certain perspective. And you see some of the very important perspective that's missing in something like Russia, Ukraine is geopolitics, which I'm not an expert of. So that is a perspective that is absent in my, I'm coming from the world of economics, finance, especially venture finance, and the future of finance, which I'm working to develop. What is the post-capitalism financing look like? This has been a really wonderful and really enlightening practice for me every year to go through and find out what's in my awareness, what's within my capacity, and what's not. And I also differentiate between integral capacity, consciousness, and integral capacity. We might have a very complex meta theory through which we can look at it, but the engagement with such complexity requires a whole other level of my capacity. And that's a hard lesson to be learned. I'll begin with a small story. I was getting initiated to become a Hindu monk. And so I was basically in that trajectory. I was really excited to meet all the people. There's so many smart people. And one of the exercises that we had to do was basically writing out our life incidents from as long as we can remember, writing every single thing down and reading out loud to your partner. And then the other person would reflect back with insights and recommendations. And I was really excited. I was really hoping that I'll be paired with somebody who's one of these really intelligent professors of some fancy university, and I'll really get to learn something about myself that I've never learned before. But luck would have me is that I got paired with a local farmer who didn't speak English. And then I was devastated. And I was like, okay, so I know a little bit of Hindi growing up in Nepal. And so I was able to communicate a little bit. Nevertheless, I wrote my whole story down. I read it out loud in English, mind you. And I was like, okay, so he's going to say something that I probably would not find useful. But man, oh man, I was shocked. I was shocked. He read me like a book. He had insights into my consciousness that I had no idea how he got it. By that time, I'd done multiple psychotherapy sessions and coaching. The way he came at me was just a force. He was of the land. He had the wisdom of the land. And he really embodied that and could see through another person in such clarity. That really blew my mind and really changed my perspective about education really is. There I was seeking enlightenment in India. What I got was a big blow to my ego. I exactly got what I was looking for. And that really changed my life around. And then I started a long journey of really understanding what is culture, what is wisdom, how is wisdom really transferred from one generation to another? How does one acquire wisdom? So oftentimes, when we look at the study of modernism and postmodernism and beyond, it oftentimes looks like a straight line. And what has happened with the Enlightenment thinkers is that a lot of the cultural sort of ontologies, the way the culture operates in the world has been bulked into pre-modern. For various reasons, we can explore that as a whole, but a lot of the modernist, empiricist sort of ways of thinking has bulked a lot of the cultural protocols and cultural ways of knowing as pre-modern. And it looks like a straight line. And obviously we're starting to talk about integral as a postmodern narrative. Metamodernism is here. There's a number of things happening that is really exciting. And oftentimes what happens is that it kind of looks like being involved in international development work. How does a culture modernize itself? Because there's such a strong praxis around what the Western form of modernity is, oftentimes through international development, through education, through different foreign policies, different cultures are, force is a strong word, and sometimes it is forced to get on this Western modernity track, when in fact, not a straight line. There's a lot more complexity, and it looks like a cultural brain that's trying to integrate everything. The Western form of modernity has a lot to offer. It has brought in tremendous amount of advances in the world, scientific revolution, all of that is amazing. And what I'm proposing is that actually the culture, when done it right, when practiced properly, can incorporate all of that. So they don't need to be in conflict. That's why you'll see, I spent a lot of time in ashrams in India, see an atheist and a religious person go to the same temple because their relationship with their practice is quite different. I think we have to rethink how the cultures modernize themselves. And this is not just my proposition. There's a growing body of work, growing body of scholarship around this now, which I'm really excited about. And this is sort of my own experience that has led me to this, is that there is a different way cultures modernize themselves. And both the Western ontologies of postmodern, integral, metamodern has a lot to offer to the traditions when done right. So we're not in conflict at all. This is actually a really exciting time to be integrated in our ontologies. A second piece, we often talk about theory of change and social transformation. How do we do social transformation? And that's really useful and helpful. But it's also, like Lynette said earlier, it's really important to listen to the culture, because many of the transformation and social innovation practices are embedded in culture. One good example is the worship of sun. There's all different ancient cultures and new cultures have some relationship with the sun, because the sun really represents a culture. Sun represents a culture because it's old and ancient, but at the same time, it's new every morning. That's how the culture renews itself. It's ancient, but for every dominant social discourse that comes along, it can renew itself. This is something that is really fascinating, many ways that we can talk about it. And each culture has their own way of renewing themselves. What does social innovation really look like? Sometimes it looks like this really complex maps of developmental models and quadrants. And sometimes it looks like a cultural dance because those dance represents certain movements, certain sourcing of deep wisdom of the land and flowing through that culture. And all the rituals, rules, and traditions are ways to basically source what life is offering into manifestation. And if you really listen, then we'll see the value of that. And oftentimes social innovation looks like something entirely different, like it looks like ritual. So what I'm proposing is like, let's have it all. Like, let's do it all in different ways. You know, one of the important things that has happened is with the Western Enlightenment and modernism, there has been a split of the big three, the science, arts, and the morals. But in sort of the traditional ontologies, they're always in conversations. They're always in oscillation with each other, which is the meta-modernism as is trying to do, which is really beautiful, is that meta-modernism positions itself as an oscillation between pre-modern tradition, postmodern, and modernism. And that's a really exciting way to think through this. One of the things that I've really discovered is when we go deep into a culture, in a tradition, what tends to happen is that it leads to something new. And that's been the practice for thousands of years. For example, in Buddhism goes through different evolution from Theravada to Mahayana to Hinayana to Vajrayana, right? And so all of these traditions are deepen and transcend. You know, they are all called Buddhism, but they have a very different ontologies, different ways of knowing, all of different practices altogether. I've found that deepening the tradition actually leads to transcend and include as well. As human beings, we tend to be universalist, meaning that we tend to basically find our ways of knowing the best. You know, that hill there is Arunachala Hill, as they call it, is considered the center of the universe. That's where the universe started. And on the right, it's the Cusco Valley, which is also the culture says is the center of the earth. So we always have our cultures tend to have the center of the universe. And so does our theory of change. We kind of have a universalist perspective. And I think it's important to recognize what is present and what is absent in the way we practice in the world. And so I'll just kind of leave that with our inquiry, that inquiring about what is present and what is absent in our theory of change in any kind of work is really, really helpful. I'll leave you with this quote by Sri Aurobindo, that by our stumbling, the world is perfected. And so we don't need to be perfect at it. So we just need to stumble on together. Thank you.
Brilliant place to bring us into the questions, Sushant. Thank you so much. Totally appreciate the stumbling. This throughout my whole life. I think we all do. I'd invite anybody who wants to ask a question to raise their hands. And just while you're thinking of that, I might kick us off. Such a strong theme through this, how the diversity has changed us, how it has surprised us. And you met a person in India, Sushant and Lynette. You experience your CEO through deep listening and the wisdom that brings. I was kind of a little bit curious if you wanted to talk a little bit about how the differences across the cultures have shaped you.
Well, I think part of it is resilience, this question of how you find ways to become resilient, because certainly some of the cultures that shaped me were quite bruising. I remember when I first went into insurance, of all things, from Greenpeace and government, one of the first things that happened was I went to a cocktail party and I got chatting to a chap who worked in sales, and he was talking about the CEO of our company, whose name was Mike. And Mike was a very enlightened person, but this person in sales didn't seem to think so. And he said to me, you know, I think Mike's gone mad. And I said, oh, well, why would you say that? And he said, I heard that he's just hired some chick from Greenpeace. And I said, that would be me. And so, you know, there is bruising along the way when you shift cultural context and when there are different expectations. Part of that is around, I think, learning to put your ego to one side, maintaining humor, seeking where there are elements of common humanity, understanding where there are not. I loved what you just said, Sushant, about different views of universalism. I mean, it makes me laugh thinking Salvador Dali told the world that Perpignan railway station in France is the center of the universe. Now, how absurd could you possibly be? So there are indeed multiple universalisms. I hear you strongly on that. So I think this question of resilience is profound. I loved what Anne wrote in the chat box, and I don't know you, around understanding differences in anger and radical transformation leadership, the distinction between destructive anger and principled outrage. That's a profoundly important distinction. And I think it takes us quite a while to understand the difference and understand the power and the benefit of the former and understand the deep danger of the latter. So that's another lesson to learn as you shift cultures, because you can be angry when there's misunderstanding. It can be angry when there's behaviors you don't understand. So understanding how your response to those situations works relative to this really important distinction, I think is very useful.
Indeed. I know Sushant's been really close to some of Monica Sharma's work as well. Sushant, do you want to jump in on anger?
Yes, Monica often tells the story of Jesus and as a example of principled anger, and how we source anger really matters. And the way if the anger is coming from our universal principles, as he describes it, then it can do wonders in the world. And there's sort of I've experienced within myself that there is a dirty anger and a clean anger. Clean anger is something that expands our awareness and consciousness and our expression in the world. And dirty anger is something that limits us, triggers our shadows and so forth. And we can feel that in our body. That's the whole point. That's another thing, that our body is such a great resource of wisdom. And I think I love the quote Ardashanti talks about, that our body is sort of the sense organs of the ultimate consciousness. It's always kind of taking in data, and if we really listen to our body, there's a lot there. And I think the anger lands in our body. Different types of anger lands in our body quite different.
How do you think it's held in other cultures? CEO of Fairtrade, Lynette's quite an inspiration, and but you've also spoken to how well the artisanal farmers present and hold this, in the space of some distress in places like COP in Glasgow.
Yes, I think, Simon, that was probably one of the more inspiring moments of my long involvement in different kinds of advocacy, particularly climate advocacy. And I've been to a lot of COPs, I might point out, and this was the first time I saw significant place given to small farmers from really some of the more vulnerable countries on earth, and to see these people supported financially and given the encouragement and the space to take their rightful place and speak strongly on their own behalf. It really was very, very interesting. There was side event after side event, and not so much actually in the formal negotiations where you have people from all over the world, African countries, Latin American countries, and so on. It was more a powerful commentary on some of the international NGOs, that in so many of the side events, the experts were not diverse. They were very largely white males, sadly, because of the nature of so much of the scientific discourse. And I'm glad to see that there's been really important developments in women and climate change. And there was a whole lot of important advocacy ahead of COP26 around groupings of women coming together to support each other, particularly experts in climate change. I guess what was important was to really examine my own role in what it means to be truly supportive, to take a back seat and help ensure that these small farmers did have their rightful place. But when you look at who is advocating actually in the belly of COP, we've got a long way to go with diversity. We really do.
It's super hard sometimes to establish structures like the way that they are. There's a reason, I guess, why they are established structures. So you see this as well, Sushant, in India and Nepal modernizing. I was wondering if you wanted to pick up on it.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, recently there was huge riots on the streets of Kathmandu, because US is planning to give $500 million, and there's been a split in the nation about what that really means for the country. So one group of people think that it comes with all kinds of handcuffs, and it's really a China strategy, because China is getting more involved in Nepal. Other people think that this is really great, we can build our infrastructure and all of that. I think both are partially true in this. So oftentimes what happens is that the engine of grant giving organization is really the engine of modernizing different countries. And so Monica talks about in her book really beautifully a concept of conscious reciprocity. People who are giving something to others, how are they receiving back? There should be a reciprocity as opposed to the power dynamics. And this is the basis of some of my work moving forward, is what is the conscious reciprocity public company look like? When somebody invests in it, it's not just financial return, they get social impact as well, but the power dynamics is quite different. And the emerging practice around that is called social finance. So there's a very interesting world that we are moving into, where the invisible hand of the market, we assume, will take care of a lot of things, and we know that it doesn't. but invisible heart of the market is also starting to emerge. And I think really it's really great to engage both in this time.
Sushant, I wonder if there's another way as well of thinking about conscious reciprocity, and that is in the way we hold our relationships at work. And again, I think a lot about the structure and processes of NGOs, of non-government organizations and international non-government organizations. And Simon, I've been thinking so much about this model of the lonely CEO that sort of copies and is not always helpful the corporate model of the lone CEO at the top of the organization. And I'm becoming interested in co-leadership models and so on, because I think, what was brutal for me as a young 30-year-old woman CEO of Greenpeace was that by being in that single hero CEO mode, I was therefore available for a form of criticism that perhaps I might not have been if I'd been able to be more vulnerable and create more co-leadership around that role. And so what I mean therefore by conscious reciprocity is so that the Simons and my fired up young activists might have behaved differently to the construction of that power role being put into one person. So I wonder about the sense of how their reciprocal behaviors may have been different in relationship to those structures.
It's a terribly good structure to hold. How do we manage the problem, the individual and the collective, as opposed to solve it with the individual or solve it with the collective? And I think I see a little bit of that question in Dimitri, you just posted in chat as well. How do we hold money as it defines so much of us, and yet it needs to be shifted?
It's definitely a longer conversation, but the conscious full spectrum finance is really about how do we embed universal principles into investment world. So if we're investing in, because we're in the world of impact investing now, there's a lot of money flowing into climate finance and all of that. There's a lot of talk about how impact is measured. What has not been talked about is what are the leadership qualities of the founders and investors. Can we move beyond debt and equity when we finance a company? So we're basically developing structures that are beyond debt and equity. The traditional way of financing, we're moving beyond that. So how do we do that? It's a very exciting time for that. I mean, we're in the world of smart contracts. We're in the world of tokenization. We're in the world of crypto economy. So there are different ways that we can architect a new smart contract that allows for different kind of financing. Now, the technology exists. What does not exist is the legal backing. That's where the work is. It's not about the technology anymore. It's really about how do we update our laws and policies that to recognize this new type of smart contracts. And so we're still in the early phases of this. We're in conversation with several funds and several companies around this, and we're building a case study. So you'll see in coming months publication around that. So I'll be happy to share that. And it's a learning process. It's a really exciting field. There's Oxford University estimates $1.2 trillion sitting on the sideline that's trying to find a new type of vehicle, and $1.2 trillion per year. So what we are basically doing is researching how to unlock that so that we can use that money to finance really transformative companies around the world. And I'm plugged into, I literally have a few hundred companies in my pipeline that I am looking at. And boy, oh boy, it's exciting. We are, the future is already here. It's not been financed and recognized legally yet. So it's a really exciting world right now.
Well, Ness, I know Fairtrade is like front and center to shifting finance as well. And just while you're coming in on that, I'd invite people, if you have a question, please put your hand up as well.
By what you're saying, Sushant. So, one of the big calls of this delegation of small farmers at COP26 was about the flow of climate finance. And essentially it hasn't flowed, and particularly not to developing countries. There were promises made at the COP in 2009, the Conference of the Parties in 2007, COP27 in Egypt, needs to be, in our view, the accountability COP, because there's been an extraordinary number of promises made and simply not delivered on, and they go back many, many years now. So what do you think might be the connection, the exciting development to the work of small farmers, for example? There's 500 million in the world. There's an awful lot of them. There are many of them on the front lines of climate impacts, but they don't want to be considered development cases or charity cases. They want to be acknowledged as business people in their own right. What do you think might be the connections and openings around innovation for them?
That is such an exciting, and I know a few projects that's addressing that already in Australia. What I've realized is there's a technological solution, but that is not complete. There's a human element to it, and that's why I think Integral does such a beautiful work of like incorporating all of that together. It's a 4-quadrant affair, basically. We need to have solution in all quadrants, and there's been a tremendous stride being made on smart contracts, and there's all kinds of companies that's trying to do this. But the human element is still there. I think there is a lot of wisdom in leadership training, in basically, there are all different models of it, bringing universal principles into the project design itself. One thing that I really like about Monica's work is that she brings in leadership and project design together. So it's not one or the other. It's basically you do it together. So that's on the human side. That's on the integrity side. What's on the technology side is that there are different kinds of smart contracts that's been developed, a new type of accounting, because one of the valuable gift of token economics is that we can value certain things that was not valued before in an economy. So we can value land and resources in ways that wasn't possible. So we assign a certain token to those elements, and we invest in those. Basically, it's still in the early phase of what we're trying to do, and different people are trying to do it in different ways. But more than the technology and human element of it, I think we have advanced technologically, but not legally. And so a lot of things, our policies are holding us back. So one of the things that I'm working on is designing a public company that basically can raise money from retail investors and institutional investors, and it goes into programs like these. But the expectation of how it's accounted, how the impact is accounted for, and what's the return is totally different. So I think there are different ways to do it. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no, I totally saw that through all the voices of the Fairtrade people speaking at COP as well. And clearly it cuts through, and clearly it's also stuck. And maybe this is a little bit of a theme around this shift.
Well, I noticed someone just, Anne made some points about blockchain, and you wouldn't believe, who would have thought that we talk about blockchain all the time, and then the questions around so it's about where we're stuck is how we access this in a way that's fair, quite fundamentally. So I spoke at a big event in London, and actually it was this week, of the World Trade Symposium, and there's so much excitement, as there should be, about digital innovation. But then there's just this fundamental question of access. And, people were saying, well, during COVID, at least the one thing that went really well was e-commerce and all sorts of digital platforms. But actually, 463 million children, according to UNICEF, went into learning crisis because they didn't have access to internet or computers in their homes, and therefore didn't go to school for 2 years. So, speaking of feeling stuck, it's this question about the universal access to things as simple as mobile phones, with all of the potential that offers us. Access is still really uneven. So I guess there's some stuckness, if I can make that a word, Simon, around that for us.
Yeah, oftentimes technology, especially blockchain, becomes the solution trying to find a problem, and and technology by itself it's a technological universalism. This idea that technology is going to solve everything, when in fact it solves a lot of things, but it also creates a divide, a new digital divide, and that's a major concern. That's a lot of people are getting left behind because of that. And I think there's a good case to be made that it is a full spectrum response, right? It is an integral response, that we have to think about multiple areas of solution at the same time. Otherwise, it's not complete. And there's a lot of technologies are actually technologically universalist. This is a really exciting time for non-technologies to get into research in technology, because there's a social science of technology that's emerging. That's been around for a long time, but especially with big data, crypto economy now, we don't have enough principled people doing that kind of research and policy making. So I think that's a huge skill that's necessary around ethics, around big data and blockchain.
Thank you, Sushant. Abigail's going to invite everybody into breakout rooms to explore that a little bit more, to explore what's opening up for us as a result of this conversation and what's feeling, stuckness. Was it stuckness, Lynette? We can climb that anyway. So expansiveness and stuckness, Abigail.